Emotional neutrality is not the absence of love, it is the emergence of self. As described in the journey of individuation outlined by Carl Jung, the soul finds its way back to stillness not through suppression, but through deep integration. When you've done the inner work, faced the shadow, and healed your wounds, you no longer react to chaos because it no longer resonates. The anger, manipulation, and emotional games that once held you hostage now pass through you like wind. This is not numbness, it is evolution. Emotional detachment born from healing is not about shutting others out, but about no longer abandoning yourself for the comfort of others. It's the moment you stop bleeding to keep peace, stop over-explaining to be understood, and stop chasing closure from those who cannot give it. You reclaim your energy, not from arrogance, but from reverence, for your time, your truth, your life. This sacred stillness may feel like loss to others, but to you, it is liberation. You've become unavailable to dysfunction not because you're heartless, but because you're whole. And in this clarity, you no longer need noise to feel alive, you have found peace within. True healing begins when you stop reacting and start observing. What once triggered emotional spirals, arguments, guilt trips, sudden silences, now fades into the background, unable to pierce the calm you've cultivated. This shift, as Carl Jung would affirm, is the fruit of shadow integration, the sacred act of meeting your pain with compassion and turning inward to reclaim your center. Emotional reactivity used to be your default, a survival mechanism rooted in unresolved wounds. But now, through deep self-awareness, you've unplugged from the emotional games and stopped offering your soul as a canvas for someone else's projections. You no longer mistake intensity for intimacy or chaos for connection. This is not detachment from life, but the beginning of conscious living. You recognize that not everyone deserves access to your emotional space and that preserving your peace is a sacred act of self-respect. Stillness has replaced struggle, and neutrality has become your quiet revolution. You're not distant, you're discerned. What others call cold, you know as clarity. You've withdrawn, not to punish, but to protect your growth. This is the new ground you walk on, unfamiliar, yet free. Because in this space of sovereignty, you are no longer who you were when the pain began. You've evolved. Emotional evolution isn't marked by how loudly you fight back, but by how peacefully you no longer engage. Carl Jung taught that when we confront our shadow, those hidden, repressed parts of the psyche, we begin to dissolve the unconscious hooks that once entangled us in dysfunctional dynamics. What once felt magnetic, chaotic, and emotionally consuming now feels like noise. You're no longer pulled into every storm because you've stopped identifying with it. This shift isn't about becoming unfeeling, it's about becoming whole. You've met your own pain, tended to your wounds, and in doing so, stopped seeking in others what only you could heal. Emotional neutrality is your sacred boundary, not a wall but a filter. You don't explain, argue, or chase closure anymore because you understand your energy is sacred and your peace is non-negotiable. Those who thrived on your reactivity now face a silence that mirrors their own shadow. And while that silence may feel cold to them, for you, it's clarity. You didn't stop loving, you stopped leaking. You didn't stop feeling, you stopped performing. This is not exile. This is emergence. You've become the guardian of your own center, and from this space, you no longer lose yourself in someone else's storm. There comes a moment in your healing when the chaos that once ignited your nervous system now barely registers. This is the quiet power of emotional neutrality, where your energy is no longer wasted on trying to fix, please, or perform. Carl Jung called this phase the sacred solitude of individuation, where the soul withdraws, not in bitterness, but in reverence for the truth it has uncovered. You are no longer tethered to the versions of yourself that sought love through overgiving or validation through chaos. You've stopped absorbing others' dysfunction as your responsibility and begun honoring your own peace as sacred. The silence you now carry is not emptiness, it's presence. It's a life reclaimed from projection and rooted in clarity. And though others may call you distant, what they're witnessing is the loss of access to a self you've outgrown. This is not detachment from love, it's devotion to self-respect. You've learned that not every emotion is yours to carry, not every storm is yours to weather. The stillness you embody now is a mirror. It disrupts, it reveals, and it protects. This is emotional maturity, not reacting out of habit, but choosing your peace as your baseline. You're not cold. You've simply come home. Emotional peace isn't a disappearance, it's a becoming. After years of living through reaction, over-explanation, and emotional entanglement, you've finally stepped into your own presence. Carl Jung taught that true individuation requires shedding the persona, the roles we were assigned, and embracing the raw, authentic self underneath. You didn't detach to hurt anyone, you detached to heal. What once triggered you, drained you, or made you feel small no longer has access, not because you're hiding, but because you've evolved. You've stopped offering your nervous system as a battlefield for someone else's chaos. Your silence isn't rejection, it's clarity. Your boundaries aren't punishment, they're protection. Now, instead of reacting to dysfunction, you witness it without absorbing it. You hold space for yourself, even when others don't understand this new version of you. You've chosen alignment over approval, peace over performance. This shift may confuse those who only knew how to reach you through your wounds, but you no longer bend to be understood. You've stopped leaking your energy into battles that never served your growth. This is the power of your stillness. It doesn't scream, it radiates. And in that stillness, you've discovered something profound. You no longer need to be rescued. You've become your own home. When you no longer react to chaos, it's not because you've gone cold, it's because you've risen above the frequency of dysfunction. Carl Jung understood that individuation, the journey to wholeness, demands a conscious withdrawal from the patterns, people, and projections that once defined your emotional reality. You no longer confuse emotional intensity with love, or silence with peace. Now, you discern. You observe without absorbing. You feel without fracturing. The emotional storms that once dictated your identity now pass without power because you've integrated your shadow, reclaimed your energy, and stopped seeking completion outside yourself. This isn't indifference, it's sacred alignment. The same chaos that once mirrored your unhealed wounds now feels foreign, because those wounds no longer run the show. Your energy is no longer scattered across conversations designed to provoke or relationships built on codependent roles. Instead, it's guarded, grounded, whole. You stopped leaking your light into places that dimmed it. This stillness is not empty, it is full of wisdom, clarity, and self-respect. You've stopped dancing for approval, stopped shrinking for connection. Now, you stand in your truth, not to prove, but to simply be. And in doing so, you've stepped into the highest form of love, presence without performance. Emotional neutrality is not the absence of feeling, it's the presence of deep integration. As Carl Jung taught, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives and we will call it fate. But once you've done the shadow work, faced your pain, healed your wounds, and reclaimed your center, your energy is no longer available for chaos disguised as connection. You stop responding to emotional bait, not because you're heartless, but because you've outgrown the patterns that once kept you entangled. The version of you that chased closure, explained endlessly, and bled empathy in toxic dynamics no longer exists. You've realized that every reaction is a transaction, and your energy is far too sacred to spend on dysfunction. Now, silence becomes your power. Stillness becomes your shield. You don't react because you no longer need to. You don't explain because your peace speaks louder. To those still rooted in drama, your calm feels like distance, but it's really sovereignty. You are not resisting them, you've simply stopped abandoning yourself. That is individuation. It's not exile, it's evolution. And while others may struggle to access this new version of you, you stand firm in the truth that no longer needing to be understood is the deepest understanding of all. There comes a sacred shift when you no longer resonate with dysfunction, not because you've shut down, but because you've healed. Carl Jung called this the sacred solitude of individuation, a phase where your soul detaches from the collective chaos to reclaim what is most true within. The connections that once felt like lifelines now feel misaligned, not out of bitterness, but because they were tied to a version of you born from wounds. As you evolve, your energy no longer anchors in the old roles, the fixer, the peacekeeper, the emotional container. You begin to grieve not only lost relationships, but the self who once needed them to feel whole. And in that grief, you awaken. What once triggered emotional turmoil now passes like background noise. This is not emptiness, it's unfamiliar stillness, the kind that only comes after deep inner transformation. You no longer chase validation or offer access to those who feed on your empathy. Your silence isn't punishment, it's reverence for your peace. Emotional neutrality becomes a quiet revolution, where you reclaim your energy, your boundaries, your truth. You're not unavailable, you're just no longer accessible through the wounds you've healed. And that is the cost, and gift, of becoming whole. You no longer react, not because you don't feel, but because you've evolved beyond the chaos that once demanded your energy. Carl Jung taught that the shadow, those unacknowledged parts of the psyche, must be integrated to reclaim wholeness. And you've done the work. You've faced the anger, the abandonment, the guilt that once ruled your reactions, and in doing so, you've rewritten your emotional script. The nervous system that once flared with every trigger is now calm, steady, sovereign. You've stopped rescuing, over-explaining, and performing in emotional dynamics that only drained you. What others call distance is actually discernment. What they see as cold is clarity. You're no longer baited into chaos because you no longer need to prove your love, worth, or truth. This is emotional liberation, not a defense mechanism, but a conscious return to your center. You no longer live through borrowed storms. You no longer mistake reactivity for connection. And when they can't reach you like before, it's not rejection, it's evolution. You're not resisting them, you've simply stopped collapsing into their projections. This is the power of healing. The power of presence. You didn't lose yourself, you found her. And now, she no longer dances to the tune of dysfunction. She chooses peace. There is a profound transformation that occurs when you no longer seek external noise to validate your existence. Carl Jung understood that the path to individuation, the becoming of one's true self, requires shedding layers of learned identity and facing the unconscious. You didn't change overnight. It took countless moments of pain, betrayal, and self-reflection to get here. What once triggered emotional spirals now passes through you with quiet clarity. You've stopped trying to be understood by those committed to misunderstanding you. You no longer chase closure, because you've discovered that peace is an internal offering, not an external gift. The roles you once played, the overgiver, the rescuer, the emotional sponge, have dissolved. And in their place stands someone whole. Your silence is not avoidance. It's strength. Your stillness is not withdrawal. It's sacred presence. The world may say you've changed, and they're right. You've evolved from survival patterns into conscious living. You no longer lose yourself in the storms of others because you've anchored yourself in truth. The chaos that once mirrored your wounds now feels foreign. This is not the end. It's your emergence. You are not numb, you are finally home in yourself. And that, above all, is the greatest healing of all. Emotional reactivity once ruled your world. Every word, silence, or shift in tone could hijack your nervous system. But now, after doing the inner work, you respond with stillness instead of spiraling. This isn't emotional detachment rooted in fear, it's self-respect born from clarity. Carl Jung taught that what we do not bring to consciousness will continue to rule us as fate. You brought it to light, the shadow, the wounds, the roles you were conditioned to play. And in doing so, you stopped leaking energy into chaos you didn't create. What once triggered a storm now barely stirs a breeze. You don't explain, you don't chase, and you no longer collapse to make others comfortable. Your silence is not cold, it's sacred. It signals that you've left behind the performance of people-pleasing and stepped into a grounded, intentional way of being. You've learned that peace isn't passive, it's a choice, a power, a boundary. Those who thrived on your old patterns may call you distant now, but you know better. You're not unavailable, you're just no longer accessible through your wounds. And in this space of emotional neutrality, you don't just survive, you align. You don't just love, you protect your love. You've stopped reacting, and in that, you've started truly living. The deepest transformation doesn't come from loud declarations, it arrives in the quiet, subtle shift when you stop reacting to what once consumed you. Carl Jung taught that shadow integration brings back the disowned parts of ourselves, making us whole. And in that wholeness, we no longer resonate with dysfunction. The chaos that once felt familiar now feels foreign. What used to ignite your nervous system barely flickers, because you've stopped identifying with pain as your compass. You no longer need to fix others to feel safe, no longer confuse reactivity with connection. Emotional neutrality is not indifference, it's a sacred milestone of evolution. You've become the calm in the storm, not because you're numb, but because you've reclaimed your energy. You've withdrawn from emotional roles you never chose, rescuer, overgiver, absorber of blame, and stepped into your truth. This is what happens when you choose presence over performance, discernment over explanation. You don't defend your peace anymore. You embody it. And those who could only access you through your wounds now find the doors closed, not out of cruelty, but clarity. You didn't change to escape your emotions, you changed to finally feel them cleanly, without distortion. This isn't the end of love. It's the beginning of conscious, grounded living. Emotional evolution is marked not by how much you feel, but by how consciously you choose to feel it. There was a time when every provocation stirred your soul, when chaos mirrored your inner fragmentation. But now, as Carl Jung so profoundly described, your shadow has been met, and the psyche no longer seeks familiar suffering to feel alive. You don't shut down, you simply no longer respond from your wounds. The emotional chaos that once defined your relationships now feels misaligned, no longer worthy of your sacred energy. You've stopped handing over your peace for temporary connection. You've stopped leaking your feelings into dynamics that fed off confusion and control. This isn't apathy, it's discernment. The difference now is presence. You're not reacting to be seen. You're grounded enough to witness without absorption. Where your identity was once shaped by the roles others gave you, you now define yourself through your inner clarity. You don't abandon yourself to suit someone else's storm. You stand, sovereign and still, a witness to what no longer holds power over you. This is not emotional emptiness. It is sacred fullness. You're not cold. You're clear. And from this place, you no longer perform love, you embody it. There comes a point on the healing journey when the storms that once uprooted you begin to pass through without disturbance. This is not numbness, it's transformation. Carl Jung taught that every psychic wound seeks resonance, and for years, your wounds sought comfort in chaos, intensity, and emotional roles that left you drained. But now, you no longer respond from survival. You've done the inner work, faced your shadow, healed your trauma bonds, and reclaimed your center. The drama that once felt magnetic now feels meaningless. What triggered deep reactions now passes through you like wind through trees, felt, but not absorbed. You've stopped confusing reactivity with connection or sacrifice with love. Your nervous system is no longer wired for emotional volatility, it's tuned to peace. And those who once reached you through your wounds now find you unreachable, not because you've blocked them, but because you've outgrown the frequency of dysfunction. This is the quiet power of individuation. You no longer explain, defend, or perform. You protect your energy because you finally understand its worth. Your stillness is no longer the result of exhaustion, it's the expression of wholeness. You're not retreating. You're rising. And in that rise, you've become a mirror, reflecting truth, clarity, and the sacred cost of becoming who you truly are. You've reached the moment when your silence speaks louder than your defense, and your stillness holds more power than your reactions ever did. Carl Jung taught that integration of the shadow, those disowned aspects of the self, is what leads to true wholeness. And now, because you've done that work, you no longer offer your emotional energy to dynamics built on projection, blame, or chaos. What once felt like love when it came wrapped in drama now feels misaligned. You've stopped mistaking intensity for intimacy and no longer abandon yourself for connection. The version of you who once tolerated emotional storms, who overexplained, overgave, and overstayed, has dissolved. And in her place stands someone rooted in clarity. Emotional neutrality isn't indifference, it's the sacred result of healing. You don't engage out of habit anymore, you choose what honors your peace. Your nervous system, once hijacked by every shift in tone or text message, now remains steady, sovereign. The people who could only reach you through your wounds now find you inaccessible, not because you've closed your heart, but because you've opened your eyes. You didn't become cold. You became clear. And in that clarity, you finally found the space to love without losing yourself. Stillness is often misunderstood. To some, it appears as coldness, distance, or emotional withdrawal, but in truth, it is clarity refined by fire. Carl Jung taught that when we stop resisting our shadow and begin integrating it, we reclaim our wholeness. That's what your stillness represents, not apathy, but presence. Not avoidance, but maturity. You no longer perform emotional labor to soothe others or bend yourself to fit their projections. The emotional chaos that once defined your connections now feels like noise you no longer dance to. You've realized that silence can be more powerful than words, and emotional neutrality more transformative than endless reaction. When you no longer react, you're not punishing anyone, you're protecting yourself. You've exited the roles of fixer, pleaser, or emotional container because those identities were rooted in your unhealed wounds. Now that you've healed, those dynamics don't fit anymore. This isn't exile, it's liberation. Your calmness forces others to confront what they've avoided in themselves. Your refusal to re-enter dysfunction is a boundary made sacred by self-awareness. And though they may not understand the version of you that no longer bleeds for their comfort, you do. You know this is not detachment. It's devotion to your truth, your peace, and your becoming. You no longer give your emotional energy away so freely, not because you've hardened, but because you've awakened. Carl Jung understood that true transformation occurs when we integrate the unconscious parts of ourselves and begin to live from wholeness, not wounding. You've learned that your energy is sacred currency, and every reaction, every explanation, every emotional rescue costs more than just time, it costs your identity. You've stopped offering your nervous system as a battleground for someone else's projections. Now, you can serve your emotional resources like a sacred offering. The impulse to overgive, to fix, to chase clarity from confusion, it's fallen away. Instead, you sit in stillness, knowing that your peace is not something to barter. This is not withdrawal, it's wisdom. You're not distancing yourself from others, you're aligning with yourself. You've realized that not every message deserves a response, not every storm needs your presence. What once felt like connection through chaos now feels like dissonance. And so, you choose differently. You choose presence over performance, self-respect over self-sacrifice. You didn't lose your capacity to love, you reclaimed it from the places it was leaking. This is what healing looks like, a quiet, powerful refusal to abandon yourself for temporary connection. You are finally home. There comes a moment in your healing when you no longer feel the need to defend, explain, or prove. Not because you don't care, but because you finally do, about yourself. Carl Jung taught that making the unconscious conscious is the path to freedom, and in doing so, you've stopped living on emotional autopilot. The storms that once consumed you now pass like distant thunder, no longer shaking your center. This isn't emotional numbness, it's clarity. You no longer respond to projections or try to fix people who refuse to face themselves. You've reclaimed your emotional energy from conversations that drain and dynamics that distort. The silence you carry now is sacred. It's not a wall, it's a boundary made of truth. Your absence from chaos isn't punishment, it's preservation. Others may call you distant or cold, but that's only because they can no longer access the version of you who needed their approval to feel whole. You've outgrown emotional survival. You've stopped confusing empathy with self-abandonment. And now, from a place of stillness, you choose peace over performance, wholeness over habit. You are no longer participating in dysfunction, not out of spite, but because you've remembered your worth. And in that remembrance, you are finally free. You didn't become cold, you became whole. After years of defining yourself through reaction, chaos, and the need to be understood, you've arrived at a place Carl Jung described as individuation, the sacred process of becoming who you truly are by integrating what you once denied. The chaos that used to mirror your inner fragmentation no longer resonates, not because you stopped feeling, but because you stopped losing yourself in what you felt. You've moved from emotional survival to sovereign stillness. The people who once accessed you through guilt, abandonment, or drama now find their entry points sealed, not with bitterness, but with self-respect. Your nervous system, once hijacked by external storms, is now regulated by inner truth. You don't chase closure. You don't explain your peace. You simply live it. Emotional neutrality is not indifference, it's discernment, born from deep inner work. You've stopped abandoning yourself to be chosen, and started choosing yourself without apology. That is the revolution. You've stopped reacting to be seen, and now you witness everything with calm clarity. You didn't just change, you emerged. The version of you that needed saving is gone. In her place stands someone who knows, stillness is strength, silence is sacred, and peace is non-negotiable. You've come full circle, not by becoming someone new, but by remembering who you've always been beneath the noise, the wounds, and the roles you were taught to play. Carl Jung believed that the soul chooses its life for growth, and you've come to realize that every heartbreak, every trigger, every moment of emotional chaos was part of that sacred contract. The pain wasn't punishment, it was guidance. It revealed the parts of you still seeking validation, still trying to earn love to feel safe. But not anymore. You've stopped participating in dynamics that demand you abandon yourself. You've withdrawn from the roles of rescuer, overgiver, emotional sponge, not out of coldness, but clarity. You now understand that your soul didn't come here to be understood by everyone. It came to evolve. And that evolution has brought you into stillness. Emotional neutrality is no longer a defense, it's a declaration. I will no longer trade my peace for proximity, my truth for comfort, or my energy for approval. The people who once fed off your reactions now stand in silence, because the version of you they depended on is no longer here. You didn't disappear, you remembered. And in that remembrance, you came home to your soul. Emotional neutrality is not the absence of feeling, it is the refined balance between thought and emotion, the dance between knowing and sensing. Carl Jung taught that thinking is electric, knowing is magnetic, and in your transformation, you've embodied both. You no longer react impulsively to external chaos because your inner compass has been realigned. What once sparked emotional fires now barely flickers, not because you are numb, but because you have rewired your energetic circuitry. You've stopped outsourcing your emotional responses to those who thrive on instability. Your presence is now magnetic, calm, discerning, sovereign. You don't rush to explain or justify, you simply observe, grounded in the deep inner knowing that you are no longer available for emotional volatility. The electric charge of reactivity has been replaced by the magnetic field of clarity. Your emotions are no longer hijacked by projection or manipulation because you've done the work. Shadow integration, nervous system regulation, and self-awareness. You've stepped into emotional intelligence, where your response is a choice, not a compulsion. This isn't spiritual bypassing, it's embodied wisdom. You've stopped leaking energy into conflict and started conserving it for creation, insight, and truth. And in doing so, you've become both the current and the conductor of your inner life. You've stopped performing for acceptance and started honoring your evolution, even when it confuses others. Carl Jung taught that true transformation begins the moment we stop living from the roles we were given and start living from the truth we uncover. That's what this shift is, liberation from emotional survival patterns. You no longer shape yourself around others' comfort. The empathy that once led you to overextend now serves as a quiet discernment. You no longer chase closure or offer explanations where understanding is refused. Instead, you hold your center, firm and clear. This isn't emotional detachment, it's self-respect. What once felt like love through chaos now feels like misalignment. The peace you now carry isn't fragile, it's earned. You've stopped explaining your worth and started embodying it. When people say you've changed, they're right, but the truth is, you've returned. Return to your values, your intuition, your inner compass. You've stopped abandoning yourself for connection, and in doing so, found a deeper connection within. This is not the end of love, it's the beginning of conscious love. Love that doesn't cost your peace. Love that doesn't ask you to shrink. You're not cold, you're clear. And from this clarity, you now create a life that reflects who you truly are. One of the most profound lessons from this content is the power of emotional neutrality as a form of self-respect and psychological maturity. In a world where reaction is often mistaken for connection, learning to observe rather than absorb becomes an act of liberation. Carl Jung's teachings remind us that our healing begins when we confront our unconscious patterns, those inherited, conditioned roles that lead us to seek love through chaos or validation through sacrifice. The moment we stop performing for approval and start honoring our peace, we reclaim our power. Emotional stillness isn't coldness, it's clarity. It's choosing not to engage with dysfunction, not out of spite, but out of reverence for your own growth. In a culture that often glorifies hustle, noise, and emotional urgency, choosing stillness and discernment can feel countercultural, but it's deeply necessary. You don't have to explain your peace or justify your boundaries. When you stop abandoning yourself to be understood, you start to feel truly seen, from within. The message is simple but powerful: your energy is sacred. Not everyone deserves access to it. And once you realize that, you begin to live not in reaction to the world, but in alignment with your truest self.